Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot dragged a woman screaming from the forest. Elias Carter had lived alone for years, his only company, the wind over the pines. One winter dusk, he found tracks too large for any man carved deep into the snow. That night, a knife marked with his father's initials lay on his porch, returned by unseen hands. But the silence broke when a woman's scream tore through the forest. Clara Dawson dragged by a giant shadow. Elias raised his rifle, breath trembling, yet something in him whispered, "Not every shadow means harm." The creature set her down, stood between her and the wolves. In that frozen night, Elias saw truth. Bigfoot was no monster but a keeper of the woods. Some legends do not destroy, some legends heal. The cry that shattered the silence. At the end of the 19th century, when the American West was still a wild, unconquered land, there was a deep valley in Montana where winter winds whipped fiercely through towering pines. In that place, among endless seas of snow, stood an old wooden cabin. Its windows glowed softly each nightfall. The cabin belonged to Elias Carter, an aging rancher who had lived alone for many years. Solitude had become his only companion. His days moved in a quiet rhythm, rising early, checking the horses, splitting logs, tending to the small herd that struggled against the biting cold. By evening, Elias would light a fire and sit before the fading coals, listening to the wind outside his door. At night, he was kept company only by the distant echo of hooves or the mournful howl of wolves. To the townsfolk, Elias was an odd man. In truth, he was only a man marked by old wounds, the loss of family, the loss of friends in storm-tossed years gone by. He had chosen seclusion, letting loneliness seep into his bones like bitter whiskey. Silence was no stranger to him. It had become his shadow, walking beside him day after day. But one dark winter's night, when snow buried the trails and the moon hid behind a veil of clouds, that silence was torn apart. Elias had just laid down when a sound rose from the depths of the forest, the desperate scream of a woman. It rang out, shattering the heavy stillness, raw, frantic, filled with despair. Startled, Elias dropped the axe from his hand. It struck the wooden floor with a dull thud. He sprang to his feet, chest tight, his weary eyes wide in the flickering firelight. That cry was unlike anything he had heard in all his years. It was not the call of a wild beast, not the howl of the wind. It was the unmistakable voice of a human being pleading for help. And in that moment, Elias understood he was no longer alone in the darkness. Out there beyond the frozen trees, someone was fighting to survive. Someone was waiting for rescue. And so began his journey from solitude into the heart of a legend. Part 1. The Sign of the Legend. The next morning, the Montana sky still hung heavy with snow. The distant ranges were buried in white, while the open field before Elias Carter's cabin lay marked only by the restless patterns of the wind. Elias opened the door, stepping out in his thick coat boots sinking to the ankles. He meant to check the horse stalls, but after only a few steps he froze. Right before him, pressed deep into the untouched snow, was a footprint, enormous, nearly twice the length of a grown man's foot and broad as a shovel. Elias stood in silence, staring, his hand drifting to scratch his coarse gray beard. He had spent a lifetime with nature. He knew the prints of deer, the tracks of bear, the marks of wolf. But this was nothing he had ever seen. Too large to belong to a man, yet not round like the paw of a bear. Its shape was half familiar, half strange. And in that moment, Elias felt the cold seep deeper than the snow beneath his boots. "Good Lord," he whispered, eyes fixed upon the print. He followed the line of tracks stretching across the open field until they vanished at the edge of the pines. The snowfall had come only hours before, which meant that whoever or whatever had left them was still near. At the forest's edge, Elias tightened his grip on the Winchester hanging at his side. From the dark shadows of the tall pines, it seemed as though countless eyes were watching him. Yet, when he listened closely, there was nothing but wind and the faint crack of breaking branches. Back at the cabin, Elias climbed the wooden steps, ready to dismiss it all as some trick of the wilderness. But just as he reached the door, he stopped cold. There, gleaming against the gray light on the snow-covered step, lay something silver. Elias bent down, picked it up, and felt his chest tighten. It was an old knife, Its blade rusted, its wooden handle carved with 3 letters JC. His hand trembled so hard he nearly dropped it. JC Jonathan Carter, his father, a man long gone, lost years ago in a violent conflict. That knife, Elias remembered well, had vanished with him on his last hunt. No body was ever found, no blade returned, and yet here it was, resting on Elias's doorstep. He sank onto the step, eyes stinging red as he gazed at the keepsake. Memories surged back, boyhood rides across the open fields, his father's warm laugh as he showed him how to sharpen a blade. Elias swallowed hard, unable to believe what he was holding. And then he remembered the tales of old Jeremiah, the native elder, who often sat before the saloon, spinning stories of the forest keeper. A towering, fur-covered being said to dwell in the snowy ranges, avoiding men, yet always watching them. Jeremiah called it by its native name, Saskets. The white settlers called it Bigfoot. The keeper of the woods is no monster. Jeremiah had once told him, eyes fixed straight into Elias's own. He takes what he takes, then gives back what he must, as the forest itself takes and gives. Do not shoot if you see him. Listen. Elias had only chuckled at the time, brushing it aside as a fireside tale for children. But now, holding the knife carved with his father's name, he was no longer so sure. That entire day, Elias managed little work. He tended his rifle, swept the cabin floor, yet his thoughts circled endlessly back to the giant footprint and the knife upon his step. From time to time, he heard the wind sighing through the forest, sounding almost like someone breathing close by. When he stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanned the misty pines, searching for a shadow that wasn't there. Night fell and the cabin glowed with lamplight, yet inside the air stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Elias sat alone before the fire, the knife resting on the wooden table flames, flickering over the letters JC. His hand shook as he traced the worn carvings. In the quiet crackle of burning logs, he heard a sound outside. Heavy steps moving past the cabin wall. Elias leapt to his feet, rifle in hand, heart racing. He threw open the door. Only snow greeted him. Snow, and the silent line of trees. And still Elias knew what he had heard. In that moment he understood he was no longer alone in the valley. Something was here, strong, mysterious, and far more knowing than he had ever imagined. And it wanted him to know. Part 2. The Woman in the Woods. That night a full moon climbed high, casting its pale silver light across the valley. The snow shimmered like a ghostly veil, as if the whole forest were breathing beneath the glow. Elias Carter had just added wood to the fire when suddenly a piercing scream ripped through the night. He leapt to his feet, heart pounding hard. It was no cry of a wild beast. It was human, the voice of a woman crying for help. Without a thought, Elias threw on his coat, seized his Winchester, and swung himself onto the back of his old Morgan horse. The animal reared its breath, steaming in the cold air, then charged into the snow. Pines rose tall and black as walls, the wind slicing like knives. Elias bent low ears, straining, following the echo of that desperate cry deeper into the woods. And then he saw it. In an open clearing under the moon, a massive shadow stood revealed. Bigfoot. Taller than any man, its thick gray-black hair, bristling shoulders, broad as a wall, its heavy steps pressing deep into the snow. In one long arm it dragged a young woman, her terrified screams carrying through the night. "Help me, please." Her cry caught in Elias's throat. He pulled hard on the reins, leapt down, raised his rifle, and shouted into the dark, "Let her go. Do it now." The sound echoed through the mountain slopes. Bigfoot halted. It neither advanced nor retreated. It only turned its head, gazing back at Elias. The moonlight struck its shadowed face, revealing eyes unlike any he had seen. They were not the eyes of a beast, yet not fully human either. In them Elias saw no rage, only hesitation. The woman writhed in its grip, tears streaming down her face. Her name was Clara Dawson, just past 20. Her young face was twisted in fear, her dress torn by thorns, her hair wild and loose. Spotting Elias, she screamed with every breath she had left, "Shoot it, kill it, please." Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. For a fleeting moment, every instinct urged him to fire. He had once been a soldier trained to end a threat before it struck, and now before him stood a towering creature holding a woman who begged for her life. What reason could there be to hesitate? And yet, something stayed his hand. Bigfoot's grip was firm but not crushing. Its huge arm held Clara but did not break her. Its broad hand did not clutch her throat, did not snap her bones. It only held her, as if afraid she might vanish into the night. Merciful God, Elias whispered, still aiming, though the barrel dipped ever so slightly. Clara's eyes pleaded through tears. Please, mister, don't let it take me. Bigfoot's breath came in heavy clouds, white against the cold air. It tilted its head, eyes locked on Elias, as if weighing his every move. And in that stillness, Elias heard again the words of old Jeremiah. The keeper of the woods is no monster. He takes and he returns. Do not shoot if you meet him. Listen. The darkness pressed close. The snow drifted down. Elias's heart beat louder than the wind. Clara's desperate cries tore at him, yet those strange eyes held him frozen. One side of him screamed to kill. The other, a quieter voice, urged patience. Above, the storm howled. Snowflakes spiraled like ash. Elias stood facing the giant, the rifle heavy in his hands, his throat dry as dust. Clara sobbed in its grasp, and still the creature did not move. It stood there, neither advancing nor retreating. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, as though time itself had stopped. At last Elias lowered his voice. No longer shouting, he spoke as he might to a wild horse. Easy now. I ain't here to fight. Bigfoot blinked, exhaling a long, misty breath. Its massive shoulders sank just slightly. Clara wept still, but the hand that held her did not tighten. Elias eased the rifle downward a fraction, though his finger stayed ready. He knew too well a single wrong move and everything could shatter. In the depth of the forest, under the watch of the moon, Elias Carter, a man long accustomed to solitude, now stood caught between two worlds, the desperate cry of humanity and the silent truth of legend. And with one decision, he would become either a killer or the witness to something beyond imagination. Part 3. The Truth Beyond the Darkness. The wind howled through the pines. Elias kept his rifle raised, heart pounding, his breath spilling white into the frozen night. Bigfoot stood tall, its massive hand still holding Clara Dawson. The young woman sobbed, begging for her life. Then from deep in the woods, another sound arose, the unified howls of wolves. This was no lone cry that Elias had often heard in the valley. It was a gathering call, 10-15 perhaps more, circling on the outskirts. The forest itself seemed to shake with their growls and the scrape of claws against snow. Clara screamed, trembling in Bigfoot's grasp. Elias scanned the darkness and saw them, pairs of golden eyes glinting from the shadows, drawing closer step by steady step. And then the unexpected happened. With a low rumble from its chest, Bigfoot gently set Clara down, so careful, so deliberate, she was left unharmed. Clara collapsed to her knees, clutching herself, eyes wide with disbelief. The giant turned its towering shoulders, shielding her from the threat. "Dear Lord," Elias whispered, lowering the barrel halfway. A wolf larger than the rest lunged forward with bared fangs. Instinct seized Elias. He fired. Boom! The rifle cracked, smoke curling into the cold night. The bullet struck the ground before the wolf's muzzle driving it back. The pack howled louder, pressing tighter around the clearing. Bigfoot roared, a sound unlike any other, deep and thunderous, rolling through the forest like a storm out of the earth itself. The wolves faltered, startled by the power in that voice. Elias fired twice more, each shot blazing muzzle flashes lighting the trees. The pack broke, scattering into the shadows. One or two cried out, then the rest retreated, their howls fading into the distance. The snowy ground lay torn and trampled, but silent once more. Only the sound of ragged breathing remained. Clara sat on the ground, face streaked with tears and snow, staring first at Elias, then at the giant who still stood before her. Bigfoot remained unmoving, shoulders broad as a wall of stone. It did not look at Clara, nor at Elias. Instead, it lifted its gaze to the moonlit sky. A heavy breath escaped, thick as smoke from a forge, before it lowered its head and stepped back into the shadows. Clara gasped. He He wasn't trying to hurt me. He saved me." Elias swallowed hard, his chest still pounding. He looked at the rifle in his hands, then at the fading figure slipping into the mist. In that instant, he understood the truth. The creature was no kidnapper. It was a protector. Slowly, Elias moved to Clara, lifting her gently to her feet. His hand was cold but steady. Clara trembled still, her young face streaked with tears, yet beneath it shone a quiet strength. She faltered, then corrected herself softly. "It stopped the wolves. Without it, I'd have been gone." Elias nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Not every shadow carries danger." Clara looked back at him, her gaze wet, her breath unsteady. And in those eyes, Elias saw the change, fear giving way to gratitude, and the shock of witnessing a truth beyond imagination. Far away, the wolves' howls had vanished, leaving only the wind and the faint crackle of the cabin's fire. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle, then lowered it completely this time. No longer did he feel he stood before a monster. Instead, he had seen a legend breathe in the cold Montana night. Bigfoot disappeared into the mist, leaving only its massive tracks pressed deep into the snow. And from that moment on, Elias knew his life, and Clara Dawson's as well, would never be the same again. Part 4. The Edge of Belief. Elias guided Clara Dawson through the deep snow, each step a weary struggle back to the cabin. She still trembled, her breath quick and uneven, her cold hands clinging to his arm as though letting go would mean being swallowed by the world itself. The moon had slipped westward, its silver light fading, leaving behind the deeper shadows of the forest night. The cabin appeared at last beyond the line of pines, its firelight glowing through the cracks like a beacon. Elias pushed the door open with a groan of wood and led Clara inside. Warmth rushed out, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold they had left behind. Clara staggered to a wooden chair near the hearth and sank into it. Elias set his rifle upon the table, then wrapped a heavy blanket around her shoulders. From the iron stove, he poured a steaming cup of tea and placed it in her hands. Clara held it tightly, the small ceramic cup warming her fingers, easing her shivers. In the glow of the fire, her face was clearer now, wide eyes, brown hair tangled, and loose lips, pale but firm. Elias sat across from her, silent, waiting. After a long pause, Clara spoke, her voice hoarse from screaming. I didn't think I'd make it out of those woods alive. Not without you. And not without him." She stopped, swallowing back tears, unwilling to name what she meant. But Elias understood. The him was no enemy. He nodded gently, urging her on. Clara gripped the cup, eyes fixed on the flames. "I came to Montana looking for my brother Jacob. He vanished 3 weeks ago on a hunting trip with friends. I followed what clues I could, wandered into the woods, and lost my way. For the first few days I survived on berries and stream water. Then the snow came heavy. I couldn't find a path. I nearly died from hunger and cold." Her voice cracked, her hand shaking. Elias quietly handed her a piece of dry bread. She nibbled at it, eyes glistening. "And then he found me," she whispered. "Not wolves, not a bear. Bigfoot. I know you won't believe me, no one ever would. But he carried me away not to kill me, but to keep me alive." Elias said nothing. His gaze fell to his calloused hands upon his knees, then to the knife carved with JC resting still upon the table. Every word Clara spoke struck at his memory. The footprints, the relic returned from the past. Clara went on. "He gave me dried berries. He let me drink from the rocks. When wolves came close, he roared and they fled. I don't know why he kept me with him. Maybe so I wouldn't stumble into worse dangers. But tonight, I know. He saved me from the pack." Tears slid down her cheeks as she whispered, "No one will believe this." But Elias, I looked into his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a beast. They were the eyes of a man, tired, lonely, but filled with meaning. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. He had heard 100 tales in the saloon, wild rumors of Bigfoot, cattle thief, man-eater, ghost of the mountains. Yet here sat a young woman alive because of that very being, and he himself had seen it too, No denial remained. In the quiet cabin, the only sounds were the crackle of fire and the moan of wind outside. Elias spoke at last, voice low and rough. Perhaps Jeremiah was right. Not every legend is meant to frighten. Some legends are true, and that truth can be kinder than many who call themselves men. Clara lifted her eyes, shimmering in the firelight. For the first time in days, she no longer looked afraid. She looked safe. In that small cabin, a larger truth took shape. Legends are not only to be feared, but to remind us where belief begins. Night deepened. The forest winds softened while the fire still burned bright, casting its glow across the lines of Elias's worn face. Clara had drifted to sleep in the chair, her breathing steady, the heavy blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. Elias sat quietly, staring out the frosted window pane. Then came a sound, faint but clear, the groan of wood on the porch, as though something heavy had been set down. Elias stiffened, hand reaching for his rifle. He stepped slowly to the door and opened it just a crack. Moonlight lay silver on the snow, and there upon the step rested something familiar. Elias bent down his hand, trembling as he touched it. The old knife carved with JC, it wasn't forgotten. Nor could it be some cruel trick. Someone, or rather he had placed it there. Elias clutched the handle, eyes burning. And in that instant, he knew Bigfoot understood. It knew his story, knew of his father long gone. And in returning this relic, it was leaving him a message. Elias stood still, chest heaving, his breath rising in clouds. His gaze lifted toward the forest, and there in the shroud of mist, a giant figure lingered. For a moment it did not move. It only watched, waiting for Elias to understand. Then gently it bowed its head, a simple gesture heavy with meaning. And turning away, it stepped into the woods until the mist swallowed it whole. Elias sank onto the wooden step, the knife clutched tight, his eyes blurred with tears. For decades he had borne his solitude, carrying loss with no belief in anything beyond himself and the hard land. Yet now, a legend of the mountains, once the subject of his scorn, had returned to him what was lost. Behind him, Clara stirred. She stepped softly onto the porch, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, eyes weary yet shining in the moonlight. She saw the knife in his hand and knew it was him, wasn't it? She whispered. Elias nodded faintly, unable to speak. Clara placed her small hand over his. Warmth spread through the chill. She looked into his eyes, solemn and certain, and said softly, "He saved me, just as he saved you." Elias closed his eyes, letting the words sink deep. Through the forest wind, her voice lingered like a prayer. In that moment, the line between man and legend blurred. Elias no longer saw Bigfoot as a monster, nor the shadows of the woods as threats. He saw only a keeper, silent, mysterious, yet kind in his own way. And in his weathered heart, long hardened, something stirred again, belief. Belief that not all that dwells in darkness is cruel. Belief that solitude is not an unbroken fate. Belief that even in a harsh wilderness, kindness can still find its place. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, the moonlight falling over them both. Elias whispered softly, almost to himself, "Not every shadow means harm." And for the first time in many years, he no longer felt alone in his cabin by the woods. Part 5. The Keeper of the Woods. Weeks passed since that fateful night. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of tender green grass at the foot of the mountains. Streams rushed stronger, carrying the familiar murmur of spring's return. The Montana Valley slowly shed its cold white shroud, and life returned once more. During that time, Elias Carter and Clara Dawson lived together in the cabin. Elias tended to Clara's recovery while she helped with chores, washing, feeding the horses, keeping the place in order. Her presence was like a fresh breeze sweeping through a life long accustomed to silence. For the first time in many years, quiet laughter, however small, touched the wooden walls at night. One morning, Elias packed supplies in silence. Clara stood on the porch, gazing at the misted mountains. The time had come for her to return to town. People there were still searching for her brother Jacob, and Clara needed to let them know she was alive. On the way back, they rode together on a single horse, crossing meadows where new shoots pressed through the soil. At the town gates, Clara turned to look at Elias. His aged eyes shone with a rare calm. The townsfolk rushed forward at the sight of Clara. Astonishment gave way to joy. Everyone wanted to know what had happened. Clara said only, "Someone saved me." When they pressed her for who, she only shook her head, avoiding the truth. For some things cannot be spoken aloud. Elias stood silent, offering no explanation. He knew if the truth were told, laughter would follow, or worse, men with guns would march into the woods. Bigfoot needed no judgment, no hunt. He belonged to the silence of the mountains. After Clara reunited with her kin, Elias made the long ride back alone. Yet the wind that day carried something different. Not the heavy weight of solitude, but the closeness of company. That night, under the rising moon, Elias walked into the forest. At a great stone along the trail, he stopped. In the earth lay a row of massive footprints, fresh and deep, but they no longer stirred fear. Instead, they felt like a message. "I am still here." Elias laid down a small cloth bundle, dried meat, a handful of berries, and the knife carved with JC. This time, he did not keep it for himself. He understood now that relic was a bridge between two worlds, man and legend. He stepped back, gazing into the mist, and there it was, the towering silhouette. Bigfoot stood motionless, a monument of the wilderness. No growl, no threat, only a distant look as though in quiet recognition. For a moment, the creature bowed its head, a gesture simple yet heavy with meaning. Then it turned, fading once more into the fog, leaving only peace behind. Elias did not call out. He did not raise his gun. He only stood, hand pressed to the brim of his hat, his heart steady and warm. Just then, Clara appeared behind him, softly speaking his name. She had returned, if only to say goodbye. When her eyes caught the vanishing shadow in the trees, she fell silent. Tears welled, not from fear, but from awe. "Perhaps," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the mist, "he was never truly alone." Elias turned to her. In their eyes, fear was gone, replaced by understanding. They stood together for a long while, listening to the wind and the stream, wrapped in a peace neither had known before. Elias knew that from now on, whenever he heard the wind sweep through the pines, whenever he saw great tracks in the earth, he would no longer feel lost. He had found something he never expected, a bond fragile yet enduring between man and legend, between solitude and belief. The sun dipped low behind the Rockies, painting streaks of red and gold across the valley. The snow reflected the glow of sunset, a canvas of quiet beauty. In the midst of it all, Elias Carter's cabin shone like a small, steadfast beacon of warmth. Clara Dawson led her horse, ready to return to town. Before leaving, she paused at the porch, glancing back at Elias. In her weary eyes rested gratitude and an unspoken promise she would return. Elias nodded, saying little. He was no stranger to farewells, but this one lifted a weight. It felt as though some piece of his long solitude had been eased. Clara's slender figure grew smaller across the plain, fading into the colors of dusk. As darkness gathered over the valley, Elias returned to the cabin. He sat upon the wooden step, the knife carved with JC resting in his hand. He lifted his gaze toward the misted ridges where the wilderness held its secrets. And in the silence he whispered, "Not every shadow means harm." His low-weathered voice was not meant for others to hear, but as a reminder to himself. Long years of suspicion and fear had ended with a simple truth: not all darkness exists to destroy. Some shadows guard some test, and some remind mankind of kindness. Night descended. The cabin glowed with firelight, its flames burning as a symbol of life enduring. And out there in the forest, Bigfoot surely walked on, silent as ever, the watchman of the wild. The giant footprints pressed into the snow were no longer threats, but proof that legend still walked beside man quietly, eternally. Elias sat in stillness, his eyes filled with new belief. No matter how many years he lived in that cabin, he knew now he would never be truly alone. The line between man and legend had blurred, and in that fading line, a bond was born. Message in the Wild West: some shadows do not destroy, they remind us of kindness and connection. If you were Elias Carter standing in that moment, would you pull the trigger or lower the rifle as he did? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more tales where legend and the Old West meet.